I'll do my best. First, I want to thank Marianne Tebben and the Center for Food Studies for inviting me to come and talk about this topic, which I'm so fascinated by. I love talking about pesticides. So I'm not talking about food, but I'm talking about the chemicals that we put on our food. And more particularly, I'm a cultural historian. I'm not a historian of science, and I'm not a biologist. I'm interested in the stories we tell about pesticides and how that shapes our attitudes about pesticides, and how those stories have encouraged our increasing use. And look, our technology has done something. Okay. So the starting point to think about the story of pesticides is to think about how ubiquitous they are, how widespread they are. And ever since the late 1940s, they have been widespread throughout the United States and in many parts of the world. And for many people, this reason might be self-evident, because people looked at the increasing productivity when you used chemicals and how much stuff you could grow, and it seemed to be so much easier to farm with the synthetic pesticides. But the stories we tell about pesticides, I argue, also made us want to keep using them, not just because it looked like we were growing more corn or more soybeans. And I argue that those stories come from a few different sources. They come from the media and media articles. They come from marketing materials from chemical companies. They come from the policies and speeches and pronouncements of government officials. And they come from bedrock ideas about the values of science, technology, and modernity. So I'm going to choose a few examples in the next few minutes to look at some of the themes that come out of these different sources and how they shape the prevailing attitudes about pesticides. So I'm going to start with what some people refer to as the golden age of synthetic pesticides, which is starting in World War II and in the years right after World War II. There was a lot of fascination with what seemed to be these miraculous chemicals, brand new chemicals that seemed to be highly effective, kill insects very easily, and seem to not be very toxic to other higher order animals such as mammals and humans. Most especially, DDT became the poster child for this new class of chemicals, and the biggest group that came out of World War II that was used right after World War II were called organochlorines, and DDT was one of the organochlorines. DDT, as you see here, was thought to be so safe that you could spray people all over their body, and that indeed was the big success story from World War II, because it was used to kill the body lice that carried typhus. And so that's why DDT first became famous right afterwards. When the war was finished, it soon became domesticated. And so we went from military use of DDT and these other synthetic chemicals to civilian use of DDT. And here you see these cute little ads, and there's a song that goes along with that jingle about DDT is good for me. And you see everyone dancing and happy because their food is coated in DDT. And then you see the housewife who is spraying her cabinet so that she won't have any ants and pesky flies and other insects like that. In addition to being used in people's homes and people's backyard gardens, of course, DDT was used by farmers all over the United States, and they were incredibly happy with how much they could grow with this chemical. There are the organochlorines. There are two other big categories of synthetic pesticides that come out of the war. In addition to the organochlorines, DDT is one of those, there's also organophosphates. Organophosphates are more acutely toxic, so they're more dangerous to people on contact, but they don't persist in the environment as much. And they came out of research into nerve gases in World War II. And the third other big category of World War II pesticides that also moved to the domestic market are herbicides, a group of herbicides called the phenoxy herbicides. And some of you probably heard about them because this is the category of herbicides that Agent Orange comes from. So the most famous phenoxy herbicide was 2,4-D, and 2,4-D was put together with 2,4,5-T, and then they became Agent Orange, and that was used widely in Vietnam, and I'll say something about that in a few minutes. So these three categories of pesticides, they become widely used in the civilian market right after the war, and there does not seem to be any problem with them, and there is not much negative said about them in the public culture. One reason that they are so easily adopted is because people believe they are modern, they are scientific, and that agriculture should be modernized and it should become a more industrialized enterprise. So many newspaper and magazine editors start to write a lot of articles that celebrate these new chemicals, that talk about them in very positive ways. There are advertisements like this that run next to the magazine and the newspaper articles. And they oftentimes explicitly link these new chemicals with what it means to be modern. So, for example, one ad in the Saturday Evening Post from 1951 said that modern farms depend on modern knowledge. So if we want to be modern, we have to use chemicals like this. Many ads emphasize the idea that they were not only effective, but that they were easy to use, and they were deadly for insects. So let me give you a couple of other quotes from ads that convey this. Expello, another brand name, Expello brought, quote, sudden death to moths, but was harmless to human beings and sweet-smelling. And another herbicide, Weed Done, would bring new, undreamed of beauty and spray away weeds easily, quickly, safely. And this enthusiasm was also encouraged by statements from the manufacturers themselves. And the manufacturers would be quoted in the magazine articles and the news articles. So, for example, the director of research for one of the big companies that made DDT, J.R. Geigy, the director of research for J.R. Geigy, predicted that DDT would save 3 million lives a year from malaria, and that DDT paint that had DDT in it, and DDT wallpaper, so you would put DDT in your wallpaper and put it all around your home. DDT paint and wallpaper might soon make mothballs obsolete and keep homes free of pests for several years. Now, one of the other themes which is really prominent in the news articles and in the advertisements for the new pesticides is the idea that humans are in a perpetual war against pests and insects. And a lot of the imagery from these ads is taken from the imagery that was just a few years old from World War II. And so a lot of people were very familiar with this military imagery, and so it was put over onto the images of pesticides. And there was a lot of emphasis on the idea that humans always had to fight this war against pests, and that it was an ongoing struggle, and it was hard to win the battle. Many articles referred to the idea that there was a battle, that it was a war, and that farmers faced an onslaught. The language, of course, continues to emphasize this military theme and this war, and a lot of the ads talk about how deadly these are, how we should kill them, how we should wipe them out, how we should eradicate them, and how we should stockpile our ammunition against the pests that threatened us. What's also important about these ads is that the ads emphasize that although this was a war, the war was not just to be waged by experts, but the war was to be waged by ordinary citizens as well. So everyone was supposed to be involved in this war, and everyone should be using these chemicals and should be encouraged to do so. Another related theme which comes up in this culture encouraging pesticide use is a theme that really resonated with a lot of people who moved to the suburbs right after World War II. Some of you might have already had some history courses that talked a lot about suburbanization after World War II, that the suburbs exploded. So a lot of people who moved to the suburbs all of a sudden had to deal with a lawn. So this was their little piece of nature, and they could control this little piece of nature, and they could make it beautiful, or they could wipe out the pests, or they could do something else to this piece of nature. And it was hard to do this if you didn't grow up in a suburban house or on a farm, and maybe you didn't know what to do with all these plants surrounding your house. And so it was much easier if you could go to the hardware store and you could buy this product, you could read the label, and then you could just spray it places, and you could feel like you're doing what you're supposed to do to take care of your lawn and your piece of nature. And a lot of magazines were published in this period of time that were directed specifically at suburbanites. Magazines, some of them are still around today, like Better Homes and Gardens. And Better Homes and Gardens would have little charts in the magazine with a table of listing a certain pest and the chemical that you're supposed to use and the time of year you're supposed to spray to make sure you don't get that pest. So there were all these helpful little how-to guides that were published about which chemicals to buy, when to use them, and how many you should have at home. I guess I should also note, and maybe this is self-evident from some of the ads that I've been showing and some of the things I've been saying so far, that there's not a lot of emphasis on the idea that there's any danger here. So here we see this woman who's just out there spraying around, and it's not like there's anything bad she should worry about. And so a lot of these articles just leave out the whole idea that there's danger, or that you have to be very careful. And really the most consistent and widely repeated safety advice that comes up is just make sure you follow label directions. Okay? And then nothing should be wrong, and it should all be fine. And indeed, sometimes there was an explanation added that everything can be dangerous, and pesticides are no more dangerous than other potential hazards. So, for example, one article in this magazine called American Home said, misuse of pesticides could be fatal, but so could the careless use of your iodine, your razor, your stepladder, or your power saw. Therefore, anything can be dangerous if you don't use it right, but if you follow the directions, then it should be fine. Now, I don't want to leave you with the idea that there was nothing negative said. What is interesting is at the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, there were 4 big national stories that did receive a lot of negative publicity. But what I think was so interesting about these stories is they received a lot of negative publicity, but it was narrowly focused. And so it ended up not questioning the reliance, the general reliance on pesticides. The 4 big stories were potential turning points in people's attitudes, but they died out. 2 stories were about massive government programs, spray programs, and 2 stories were about food contamination. The massive government spray programs were efforts to eradicate these 2 pests. One is the fire ant, and this is actually a drawing from a government agency. It's from the Department of Agriculture because they made a film about how awful the fire ant is, and so this is the fire ant in the film. So there was a massive government program to eradicate the fire ant and to eradicate the gypsy moth. And there were thousands of gallons of pesticides sprayed over millions of acres across the United States in different regions to eradicate these 2 pests. The 2 programs were hugely ambitious, wild overreach, and they were designed to eradicate the pests, to eliminate them completely as opposed to controlling the pests. So there was a lot of there were many negative stories about these 2 campaigns because they seemed so over the top, so crazy, such an overreach, and they totally failed. They didn't work. And they poisoned many other animals, and so there were dead fish in different ponds and streams, and there were dead birds and small mammals, and so they were kind of a publicity disaster. What's interesting, though, is that the disaster aspect of these programs were really laid at the feet of government hubris and government overreach and the government execution of the programs, as opposed to the idea that there's anything wrong with spraying millions of acres with chemicals. At the same time, there were 2 other controversies about contamination of food. One was about DDT residue in milk that little children were drinking, and the other was about residue of a herbicide, Amino Triazole, in cranberries. And that story broke right before Thanksgiving in 1959. Very bad timing to have contaminated cranberries. So both of these stories received a lot of negative publicity, especially since they touched these highly symbolic things, milk for little kids and cranberries on Thanksgiving. But again, what was interesting about these 2 scandals was that they blew up and then they went away. They were narrowly focused in many respects, is what I think is the outcome of this. It was about pesticides on milk, not pesticides on corn, right? So it was not questioning the bigger system. One of the things which is important, though, about these 4 stories is that they laid the groundwork for the publication of Silent Spring. How many people of the students have heard of Silent Spring? Students. Okay, well, okay. I assumed you had. I was just wondering how many other people had heard it too. Okay, so Silent Spring was this turning point in terms of people's understanding of the environment and the intersection of the environment. It's published in 1962. And when Rachel Carson published this book, a lot of people had just read these 4 big negative stories. And so they were kind of primed for it. Big sensation, bestseller throughout the world, very important book in many reasons. What's interesting in the articles about Silent Spring and Rachel Carson, and some of the articles talked about whether or not she knew her science, what her credentials were, stuff like that. But the prominent theme after that, the next most prominent theme after that in all the articles about the book, was the reassurance that Rachel Carson, the godmother of environmentalism, modern environmentalism, was not calling for the end of all pesticide use. For example, the review in the New York Times in 1962 said, quote, "Ms. Carson understands that chemical sprays are a permanent part of technology." Other reviews said, "She was not advocating the overnight abolition of all chemical pesticides." Another review said, "She does not suggest that we suddenly stop using all pesticides." And finally, another review said, "And she does not suggest that modern pest control be abandoned." Instead, the most important recommendation in Silent Spring, according to all these articles, and when you read her book, this is at the core of the book as well, is that she's talking about getting rid of the misuse, the overuse, the indiscriminate use of synthetic pesticides. Which means that there's a place for the moderate use, the proper use, the continuing use of synthetic pesticides. And this is one of the great ironies of this incredibly important book, but it preached a message of moderation as well. And I want to quickly just skim over a couple of other ways in which when there was a potential for attitudes to change towards pesticides, but they didn't. One of the contemporary examples happening when Rachel Carson published her book was the introduction of Agent Orange throughout, to be sprayed airily throughout Vietnam. Agent Orange was sprayed for most of the 1960s, for most of the Vietnam War, to kill plants, so you defoliate the landscape so enemy fighters can't hide, and to destroy crops, to destroy food that the enemy might eat. But what ends up happening, there's not a lot of press coverage about this at the time. At the very end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, then there's a lot of negative publicity about Agent Orange because a lot of American soldiers who fought there have severe health consequences from the spray of this poison all over Vietnam. And there are exposés in the press. One of the biggest journalists who wrote an expose was this guy named Thomas Whiteside. And there was a lot of attention to the abuse of veterans and how badly they were treated. But what's really interesting is the whole narrative shifts to the poor treatment of the veterans as opposed to questioning whether or not it was right to spray chemicals all over the countryside. So a lot of people failed to connect the Agent Orange story with use of pesticides in general and growing use of herbicides. Also in the 1980s is the tragedy in Bhopal, India in 1984, which if anything might wake people up about the dangers of pesticides, might have been this event when thousands of people are killed in one night in December in 1984 when a pesticide leak escapes from this manufacturing plant in India that's making a pesticide, and not only were people killed that night, they were killed for subsequent months and years after, and many people are still living with health effects of this poisoning. It also did not change a lot of attitudes at home. At the same time, there was publicity about a lot of water wells that had been poisoned in the United States. That also did not seem to have a lasting effect. A decade and a half later, there's a lot more attention to the use of pesticides that are endocrine disruptors. And in this case, there was a lot of focus on atrazine, which interfered with sexual development, especially of amphibians, and you were getting deformed wildlife throughout the United States. A lot of attention again, short-lived in many respects. So I want to end with thinking about where we are today in terms of our continuing embrace of pesticides. The use of pesticides are more widespread than ever throughout the world. Sometimes they're used by industrial farmers in the United States. Sometimes they're used by farm workers in different places around the world, like this guy. He's got the pesticides in his backpack, and he doesn't have any other protective gear, and he's going to be going through the fields spraying and being exposed, and then he'll go home at night, and his kids might climb on his lap, and they will be sitting on his contaminated clothes, and they will get this contamination all over them. There are many people today who fall victim to acute poisoning, and they will die immediately or become seriously ill immediately. But in some respects, maybe what's more difficult to get our hands on are the more subtle effects of pesticides. Sometimes ones that seem to be invisible were invisible or continue to be invisible. So there's a lot of current research into the effects of pesticides, and more research that's finding links between pesticides and other endocrine disruptors and skyrocketing diabetes, obesity, autism, and other cognitive disorders. And I'm just going to show you two sets of drawings which illustrate some of the cognitive effects. These are taken from an anthropologist, Elizabeth Gillette, who went down to Mexico, and she was working with agricultural people in Mexico. So the drawings on the left are from the foothills area where there was very little pesticide spraying where these children were. The drawings on the right were from kids who lived in these valley villages where there was extreme amounts of pesticides sprayed. And you can see that the ages are parallel, but you're looking at the difference in the cognitive and motor development of these kids. And here's another set looking at the difference between how children develop depending on where they are living. And I think the differences are really striking. Nevertheless, we continue to use pesticides in greater amounts than ever before. And I think there are a lot of reasons for this. In the past few minutes, I've just tried to sketch out some of the origins of this embrace of pesticides. People embrace them for material reasons and seeing an economic benefit. They embrace them because they have a personal economic interest. They embrace them because political structures encourage their continued use. But I would add, as I've been saying in the past few minutes, that we also embrace them because of stories that we tell about them that make them acceptable, that make them good in our eyes, that make them non-threatening, and that make us want to keep using them. And I think these stories have been remarkably adaptable and persistent for more than half a century. And I think that's where we still are today. Thanks.
Josh, take it away.
Josh, are you using this?
No.
Go ahead, Josh.
All right, yeah. That was a little depressing for me. It's a lot to really take in. It's a lot to be complicit in. You know, we all have enjoyed the benefits of pesticides to our food system, to make our lawns green or what have you. We're all complicit in this in North America and involved in a part of this system. So it's a little bit much to take in for me. In the time that I'm speaking, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, a little bit about permaculture, and a little bit about the project that we have going on in New Hampshire. So I'll get started right off. I was born in 1971. It was the first year of Earth Day, you know, that sort of thing. It was a real awakening that some of the people that are a little bit younger than me probably don't recognize quite yet. I mean, the era of the 50s and the 60s was really this like blue collar, you know, industrial type atmosphere in the United States. And when we had these pictures from outer space of the planet for the first time, there was a cultural awakening. Like people were like, wow, this is a beautiful spot in the universe and we need to start taking care of it. So there was like a catalyst at that moment. And I was lucky to be born into that in 1971. And so there was a lot in my upbringing that was very positive in that recognition, but there was also this like nagging feeling that we're part of the problem. So as I matriculated and sort of grew up and started gaining awareness about my surroundings, there was always that dichotomy, you know, this little like nagging sensation that we were part of the problem. So, like I said, as I sort of gained awareness, I grew up in eastern North Carolina in an area that was under intense growth. So when we moved to the neighborhood we settled in, there was like 5 houses and farmland, and by the time we left, there was like 33 houses. Tremendous amount of growth during that time. One of the things that really struck me, I used to go crab fishing a lot when I was a kid, like 4 or 5 years old. They'd just send me out back and like a chicken bone on a string, and you stick the chicken bone down in the water, and crabs would come up to it, and you just snatch them. Yeah, we'd go crab fishing all morning. It was great, and then you roast them up in the evening. By the time I became like a teenager, there was no more crabs. Like they're gone. It was very rare that you could find them, and it was a result of the massive expansion of use of fertilizers and pesticides. There was right near the place where I was doing the fishing was a place called Coastal Chemicals, and they destroyed the Pamlico Sound. And so, like, these sort of ramifications, really, like, when you're 5 and, you're loving the crabs, and by the time you're a teenager, they're all gone, it's like, wow, we really had a tremendous effect in a short amount of time. And it really set the tone for my life, because I did feel somewhat responsible. So I went to college, and I studied environmental conservation, which really, if you want to go to college and study something, this is a depressing major. It's all about, overpopulation, resource depletion, climate chaos, pollution, pesticides, there's tons of problems to the world. And what I found really lacking in that academic setting was they really weren't very heavy on solutions. It was like, just repeat after me, these are the problems. But nobody was saying, well, we can do something about this. And sure there's recycling, sure there's composting, but overall, how are we going to address this very complex, very powerful system that's in place? And so fortunately I was turned on to this term, permaculture. Really, it's just a word, but it implies a whole heck of a lot. Permaculture to me is a scientific study. It's a field of study, just like architecture or engineering or anthropology. In fact, it has some advantages to those specific fields because it integrates many different fields. So it's integrating sociology, it's integrating anthropology, economics, scientific studies of chemistry and biology. So it's really a multi-dimensional, holistic study. So when you're thinking about permaculture, what's the goals of permaculture? So the goal to me would be perpetuation of our species. And that's a really serious need right now. When we talk about polar bears going extinct or, different species really facing challenges, we need to be also looking in the mirror. Because we're on the list too, folks. It's not just polar bears. So we really need to take over an approach of responsibility, and an approach that really tries to address these issues, versus sort of trying to sweep it under the carpet and just, that's business as usual. Let's keep going more heavy. We need to stop and really take a hard look at our culture, our economy, our ways of doing business. So permaculture, one of the real strong tenets of permaculture that I think also separates it from individual fields of studies is it has an ethic, right? So it's almost like you're an architect with ethics, and the ethics are earth care, people care, and fair share. And earth care and people care, I think that makes fairly good sense right off. Fair share, that's like if we have a big cake. Like if you don't need to eat, you should pass the cake. If you're take a slice, don't eat half the cake. You know what I'm saying? Fair share. So it's just an ethic in terms of how we operate as a culture and as a society. It's about sharing. With these principles and with that ethic, permaculture, I was fortunate to come into a farm. My family owns a farm in New Hampshire, about 3.5 hours north of here. And I was fortunate to be able to move there and live with my 89-year-old aunt in 1997 when I was 25 years old. And the idea was we were looking to experiment and try to create a different model for occupying the land. A model in which it's not so much tied to profit, and it's not so much tied to ownership and accumulating value as a real estate. What we're looking to do is perpetuate on the land and help our greater community. So it's sort of, the farm project is a lot like, we definitely do a lot of farming there, but it's also like a community outreach center. It's also like a school. We also do overnight accommodations, so it's also like a bed and breakfast. It's also, it's a community center. It's like a rural YMCA. It's just, we have all kinds of events, that potlucks and open mics and so forth, where we're just trying to get people in the same room together. So many people just know each other in our neck of the woods by whose car they, you drive that blue sedan. They don't really know each other. So it's about getting people in the same room, and it's about getting them awareness of food. Specifically, food you can grow in that area, local food. So we're always focusing on seasonal food. So that, when we get up there in our farming, we have this community outreach element, and then on our farm, we're trying to be as self-sufficient as possible, really focusing on the natural resources. So we're doing a type of gardening, forest gardening, edible forest gardening, which is different than just planting rows and rows of corn. It's about mimicking the natural forest and growing fruit and nut trees versus just like a field of soybeans. I think I would really like to get the discussion going myself. I'm cutting it brief. We have this whole book about DAcres that's like 700 pages. If you want to know about raising oxen or planting a forest garden or something like that, get into that book or come visit us and call us directly. We also do a live-in program. So if you're interested in becoming a farmer or just becoming more active and aware, you can come live with us and you become part of the system. I think that gets into the bigger picture of DAcres and transferring away from a family farm. I mean, family farms are great. There's really so many great things to be said about farming with your family, but also marriage has a 50% failure rate. So if you're betting your farm on your marriage, and the thing is too, a lot of the type of agriculture that we're doing, we're planting black walnuts and trees that really don't give you bushels of nuts till they're like 50, 80 years old. So if you're depending on one generation, like it's not going to do it. Like we need intergenerational occupation of the land. So with that sort of perennial model to get to this Garden of Eden that we're looking for. So having continual occupancy of the land and multi-generation, so there's always young, vibrant people ready to do the labor at hand is super important. Like when I came to my aunt's farm, and she's 89 years old, it's in decline. Like there's still infrastructure, but we had to do a lot of repair to get the place back up and running. Farms, to be perpetuating, need to be always in that service. We don't need, like the average age of the American farmers right now, 55, 60 years old. Like that's getting on. So, to do some of the labor that's at hand. So, without further ado, I think I would
So
like
Michelle, if I
to...
could ask you to come up front, and then maybe we'll open up the audience. So if you have questions, if you want to make comments, and I'll let you two manage the back and forth session.
I really want to touch on sort of that theme that it's the cultural significance in terms of like how we're addressing pests. It does seem to me a lot like a war, and maybe that's how our culture is really just in that sort of mindset, and how to get away from that cycle in some sense. I think that's important.
Well, on your farm, how do you talk about pests? Are you in a war with them?
Well, it depends.
It's relative, right? It's situational.
I think for a large, what we're really about is diversity and abundance, and so in a situation where you have just a whole field of corn, you're very susceptible to things that like corn. But if you have a little corn here, a little squash here, pea, you're mixing it all up, it doesn't create that preponderance on the system where you're really dependent on one commodity and the bugs, they know where it's at. So it's about interplanting, companion planting, integration of the farm system. There are definitely pests that are problematic. Colorado potato beetle we were talking about on the ride down is just like, it'll drive you nuts. If you don't do anything about it, it'll destroy your crop. Hand picking these little brown maggoty looking bugs is something most people don't enjoy, but I love potatoes. So I find the time.
So I think what you were just explaining is really important and I just want to make sure I wasn't trying to give the impression of being a Pollyanna that everyone loves the bugs. I mean, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not. What I was commenting on is this idea that when you have a mindset that they're all bad and they're always bad, then you're not thinking about this complementary system, and you're not thinking about how one type of insect will be really helpful to get rid of another beetle that you don't want. And then if you don't have too much of the same type of crop, if you don't monocrop, but you have a lot of that mixture, then it's such a healthier system. So it's not that we're all supposed to say, oh, we love to have beetles crawling on our potatoes. It's that you want to think about what's happening in the system, and is there a way that you can complicate it or change the environment so that maybe that bug is not going to be so attractive to that potato.
So to get into the nitty-gritty of that, like to take a holistic approach at pest management, say you got a problem with your apple trees. You're running into an insect, say the apple borer. It's just driving you crazy. It's killing trees. Apple borers will. They'll kill juvenile trees. It's this little bug that bores right into the base. Dead apple tree. You spend $20 on it. You nursed it along for 4 or 5 years, and then it falls over and dead. And then you look at it and you're like, oh wow, this bug just destroyed the whole trunk of the tree. So the apple borer. How do you get rid of the apple borer? Well, you can spray something and kill all the bugs everywhere, or a large portion of the bugs everywhere. life cycle, see where there's phases of its life cycle that perhaps you can intercede and take some action. You know, say if you paint the stem of the trunk of your tree, that reduces the apple borer prevalence by 15 or 20%. And then you put out some bait traps at certain times of its life cycle where it's real susceptible, and that takes out another 15 to 20%. And then you maybe do some introduction of some predator species, or try to include the plants that would be habitat for that predator. And that takes up another 20% of your pest problem. All of a sudden, you've got 60% of that pest problem taken care of, and the last 40% is what you're trying to work out. So you've reduced your pest problem by half without spraying anything, by just sort of looking at the life cycle of the insect and identifying ways that you can get in there and divert it at certain points of its life cycle. That's more of an integrated pest approach than just doing a spray. Yeah. Question?
I'm always amazed at how often overpopulation is not discussed when we talk. For example, do you think that the kind of growth we have now, could we sustain the population without using pesticides? Josh, would your way of farming keep up with because I don't know how many people your farm can.
Oh yeah, I think that's a very sort of sophisticated question in many levels. To me, there is a population challenge, particularly I think in urban areas, where people are just so tightly packed in there, and the resources from the countryside, be it food, be it energy, are being poured into it, and they're unable to provide for themselves. In terms of what our population threshold is, I hesitate to guess. I think we do have all the tools to feed the people. Where I think we're probably going to run into the biggest differences with our population and our challenges is the getting along. That's really where the numbers sort of get overwhelming. You get these just tremendous numbers of people in need. How do you manage those situations? We say we have refugees running around and stuff like that. It's really just difficult to imagine. But yeah, I think we have a lot of the tools at hand, and whether it's 500 million, 3 billion, 9 billion, what's the threshold? I think it still goes back to the getting along. So I think that's the biggest challenge in that population.
Let me just add something too about the productivity question, because I think this is a really, really important question, and a lot of people will go to this because it's so elemental. It's really important. Part of the idea that we can't raise enough food in an alternative system is based on certain myths and assumptions about industrial agriculture. So there have been a number of studies that have looked at per acre productivity of non-industrial agriculture versus industrial agriculture. And depending on how it's done, there is non-industrial agriculture, which is more productive per acre than industrial agriculture. So a lot of it is about approach. It's about complementary planting. It's about how we're measuring productivity versus cost as well, because using chemicals is not as inexpensive and no cost as we think. It's very expensive for individual farmers, so it prices individual farmers out of the market. So a lot of people get pushed out of the market. There are also all these hidden costs. There are hidden health costs that we have to pay for. There are hidden oil costs that we pay for all the time. So there are lots of hidden costs. But in terms of just looking at what can be grown on different acres of land, there are a lot of examples. The other reason that we always get worried about this question, and I think rightly so, is because our existing food structure is an industrialized food structure. So it is harder to take non-industrialized agriculture and then plunk it onto our industrial food system. So a lot of people who are invested in our existing food system say, oh, we can't do that. We can't feed the world like that, because it is not exactly compatible with the existing system we have. You know, the big supermarket does not want to get carrots from 30 different people. They want one supplier. So part of that is the mismatch, right?
Yeah, there's tremendous inefficiencies in the system. The fact that, you know, us in New England are eating so many apples from Chile is just ridiculous. I mean, Chile is so far away. And there's so many apples in New England. And it's just a matter of, you know, the proper storage and so forth. I can walk down in my basement, you know, get home tonight and have an apple. You know, there's no reason, no refrigeration. You just put it in sawdust and put it in your root cellar. There's so much food production that we have just sort of neglected. I mean, you see so many apples just on the side of the road on the ground.
So when we get apples from Chile, they're cheaper or they're better?
They're definitely not better.
They're cheaper for the food supplier that supplies the supermarket, because that's their whole system, right? It's more efficient for them to deal with a big supplier, to have one monoculture. We want this many cases of gala apples. We don't want anything else. We don't want any blemishes. We want them uniform size, and you can get them to us on a set date.
But are they getting them now from Chile because they're in season in Chile, or are they getting them from Chile because they're...
Both.
I'm sorry?
I think you're getting at both.
Both?
Yeah, there's a little bit because it's in season, and a little bit because of the economies of scale. Just the land price is a little bit cheaper, the labor cost is a little bit cheaper, all the inputs, and the transportation is just so darn cheap to get it up here, the cost of oil. I mean, you think about right now, everything in our food system in New England, 95% of it is coming from California and Mexico. And it's just cheaper because of the labor, because we're using migrant labor. I mean, that has to just be put bottom line. Yeah, there's a lot of migrant labor in our food system. We are really dependent on people, undocumented workers, to get the food on our plate. So the labor is cheap, and then there's the products of scale. The availability of the farmland, the subsidies, that it makes it actually cheaper to grow this stuff in California and freeze it, flash freeze it, put it in a freezer, ship it all the way to this side of the country, put it in a freezer in a grocery store where it's probably 20 degrees outside. All this stuff is still cheaper to do than growing it ourselves at home.
Though of course it's cheaper now, but as you were saying at the very beginning of your talk, when you're thinking about these unintended consequences, and in terms of global warming, all that petroleum moving the food every which way and refrigerating it is not cheaper, because it's ruining our environment. And
The externalities.
Yeah. And I would just add one other thing about the production thing, and that is the level of food waste that we have in the United States is staggering. It's over 25%. I did read
40%.
one statistic
Over
that was
40.
40% too. And then I saw two people that argued about the 25 versus 40, but they were saying it was 40% because they were looking at every single extra thing that was in the field as well that hadn't been harvested and was left in the field. So I've read both numbers, but I think...
We collect food waste from the town that's adjacent to us, Plymouth, New Hampshire. And so we go to the local grocery store, we go to the university, we go to Main Street restaurants, and we bring home about 4,000 pounds per week.
Wow.
So you go on a normal day to the supermarket, you know, a banana box, I get 20, 25 of those full up with produce that is fine to eat. They've just overstocked. They just need, you walk into a grocery store and you notice now, all those bins are totally full. And they're totally full with just primo looking stuff. And you'll watch the produce guy, he's going through anything that's got a tiny little blemish on it, he's tossing. Because we are so demanding as consumers, there's just no seconds. Like, they don't sell brown bananas up here, do they? But brown bananas are, taste better. It's just like our consumer mentality is driving that inefficiency and driving that waste. We can't take a second and be happy with it.
So I grew up on a dairy farm that was in our family for 120 years. So we have actually 600 acres, and we also have about 6,000 maple trees that we make maple syrup from. So on that farm is me, my dad, and my uncle. For maple syrup, it's just me and my dad. And you spoke about the economic benefits of using pesticide and everything. So some of my friends who are also farmers, they use pesticide. We don't use as much. And there's actually a friend of ours that stopped using it, and because of a yellow wildflower that was in his fields, it actually caused half of his herd to go sick. And because, I don't know if you're aware of this, but when you harvest a field, you usually, if you're harvesting silage, you'll pack all the food together, and it caused a lot of that food to go bad. So it ended up costing him about $30,000. Doesn't have a herd anymore, no longer a farmer. I think it's more of a problem of not being able to stop using pesticides rather than using it for economic benefits. Because I just don't see any farmers going into the industry to make money. So I just wanted to hear your perspective as to what should be done in that situation. Because the way I see it, if my family didn't use pesticides to farm, if we didn't try and boost herd production, I wouldn't be going to school here. So I think it's a lot of the issue of you're put into a poverty trap, you can't get out. How do you beat that?
That's a fantastic question or terrible dilemma that, you've just laid out. And I guess there are a couple of different thoughts that go through my mind about it. One, what you were just describing is that there's an expression that a lot of people use, the pesticide treadmill. You get on the treadmill and then you can't get off. And then you become dependent on the pesticides for labor reasons, because you don't have as many people to work as many acres, and so you need fewer people. If you don't use pesticides, it's more labor intensive. So you get on this treadmill and you're trapped because of labor reasons or because of the investment that you have in the land, and you feel like you have to be really productive per acre. I think there are a couple of different dilemmas. I don't know anything specific about dairy farming. I think what is interesting, though, is there are some dairy farmers in recent years, because the price of milk has plummeted so much. There are some dairy farmers that went the organic route because they could then get more money for the milk, because the profit that you can make on organic milk is so much higher than the profit that you can make on non-organic milk. But that takes a few years, and you have to do the changeover, and it's a very difficult, involved process. It's not like there's some easy way, I think, to switch from one to the other. I think there are some farmers that do it or experiment. I guess it also is probably dependent on the amount of land you have, the number of acres and the number of head you have, and how many people you have to work it. But you are laying out a really big dilemma. But there are a number of dairy farmers who have gone out of business because the price of milk collapsed. So I went to a presentation a couple of years ago with a historian who had gone and visited all these dairy farmers who made a switch. And so she did all these interviews and looking at why they made the switch, and they didn't do it for philosophical reasons, but they did it for economic reasons. That was their motivation, because they thought, I'll get more for my milk if I do this. But it's a really hard issue, what you just laid out. I don't know what you want.
Oh yeah, the dairy business is a very, very tough business to be in. And I definitely admire you and your family for sticking with it, because it's daunting. I think for me, there's two courses. 600 acres is a big slice, and you got a small group of people. The two directions I go, a long-term business plan is figuring out ways to get more people to help, various ways to bring more people in. And I think it is, the pesticides can save on labor, and so if you can bring more people in. If you looking to integrate more people, if there's also ways that you can figure out how to value add. So what I'm talking about there is trying to get direct to consumer more, so you can get out the middleman. Whoever's brokering your milk, maybe go direct to consumer. There's a good raw milk market that's burgeoning. With the maple syrup, same thing. If you can figure out ways to open up a retail type operation on site and make more money versus putting it to the middleman. In general, it sounds like you have a slice of heaven that you probably very much, is your home. Trying to figure out ways to share it with others, that great gift that you have, and figuring out different ways that, you can invite the public, maybe, bring school groups on, make a little revenue through your school groups, get the school groups really attached to your place like you are, so for generations to come, people remember that from their youth, and really it becomes a more vibrant and place-based type farm. That'd just be sort of brushstrokes, but dairy business is so tough. Gosh, the commodity price, water's more expensive than milk sometimes, so it's rough. Did you have something you wanted to keep going with?
Yeah, if you take a lot of dairy farmers, if you take where you're selling your milk and you say you go to regularly directly to consumers, we actually have a deal through Cabot, which we've been providing milk for them for the last 30 years. If you were to take your milk and go directly to consumers, you no longer have that deal with Cabot. Same with Chobani, same with a lot of other yogurts and cheeses. So you can't, there's no way to successfully move to that position. And as you're talking about with organic farming, in order to be labeled as an organic producer, you have to let your fields go fallow for 3 years.
Yeah.
So 600 acres for 3 years, you're paying taxes, you're losing about $25,000 a month. You can't do that.
Well, obviously the government needs to step in and be supportive of these changes. If organic is safer for the people, then the government needs to take steps to ensure safety. I think, we need to help support those transitions. So, if you're on your own, it sounds like a very tough transition. Other ways, just raising the issue, conservation easements can help with that transition as well. Just sort of looking at what's available and building an integrated plan to make the transition. But it's a tough thing you're working with. And, it's a legacy. 600 acres, keeping that from growing houses, I mean, you're saving the world. So more power to you.
I told him you were.
So I think that leads right into my question. You brought the government, and I apologize in advance because this question is a bit broad. So with, say, an intended goal of moving to a permaculture system or a non-herbicide, pesticide system, how do you sort of approach the, let's just say the major obstacle, in which we can say there's like three major pillars, like government, fast food industry, and say commercial farming, where fast food say has a foothold in a consumer basis where it's cheaper for a meal based from say commercial farming, and then commercial farming is cheaper based on herbicide pesticide system, and then government with the Department of Agriculture and the FDA. How do you approach that? Is it more a dismantling of the current system, or is it using that system to redirect kind of the image and redirect kind of the intent of farming? Like, do you use the resources at hand to move into, say, a permaculture system, which who even knows if that's possible? And how do you change, hearts and minds, right? You're facing the massive power of corporate lobbying, and you really wonder, you can reach out to people, in talks like this, and you can reach out through a broad range of programs, but ultimately, how do you, and I hate to say it because, there's that discussion about, a war against pests or things like that, but how do you fight this idea that this is good, that organic is good, that this form of farming is good and healthy for you, that it really should be the only option?
Oh, yeah. Corporate personhood is just a huge component of this. When we talk about the incident in Bhopal, India, Union Carbide, the company that was responsible for that, they went bankrupt, just disappeared. No one ever paid. No one ever, helped the families. 35,000 people died in 3 days or something like that. And nobody helped. There's just the corporate model is what is preventing accountability for some of these issues. So I think that's a large component of this, is trying to change that structure. So we are more responsible in that regard.
I'll just mention quickly, I think that part of the framework that you were throwing out there about fast food, which I was putting in my mind in the same category as processed industrial food, right? And then you were making that as an oppositional category to organic food. One of the dilemmas that I would throw out there is that today there are different types of organic food. So there is organic food, which might be, what's the name of your farm?
Home cooking.
Home cooking farm. Or you can go to your giant supermarket, that's the supermarket where I live, and there's the organic section, and you can buy your package of organic food, and that's industrial organic. So I would just throw out there that the categories are more complicated now as well, so there are different ways of thinking about organic. So you can shift to organic by plugging into the industrial agricultural system and food processing system. Or you can say, no, we're going to go in a different direction. Or you can do both at once and say they're both good because we can't do only one. But it's very problematic to think about the shift, and it's especially problematic to think about the shift because one is easier and one is harder. So if I can go to my supermarket and buy my box of organic rice, phew, I don't have to worry about changing our agriculture system. Because look, here's my rice. So unless you want to do something to try to shake up that system, then you can just keep going along and have your little 5% organic food and say, great, 5% is organic food, and we'll just leave the rest of the 95% the way it is. So that's a hard question.
So, an element that I was picking up on with this is sort of the social justice question, I guess. Because cheap food is cheap. And, you know, it's the food. If you have affluence, you can come by this organic, this really healthy food. But if you live in Brooklyn somewhere in some food desert, and the only store within 15 blocks is a little convenience store where you can just get some white bread and bologna, like, you're stuck. And so, you know, I think it has bigger questions in terms of making this transition to a healthy people, and really getting the clue that the fast food is cheap food, and it's just a quick trip to the hospital. Somebody, Bree, who drove down with me, works in a hospital where you're just dealing with lots of like internal problems. Like, you don't want to end up with clogged bowels. You know, colonoscopy does not sound like a good way to spend the afternoon. And it's all about, you know, clogging up your system with junk, with processed things, versus eating whole foods that actually, you know, make you healthy and clean. If you eat plastic and you know, foods that are pseudoplastics, it's not going to come out well.
Right, and that's awful. And it's taken by, and definitely people recognize that. But the issue is that a corporate system has been designed so that now it's cheaper to go along with this food that is worse for you compared to, you know, the different categories of organic, right? And then, so I guess the main point I was trying to get at is, how do you fight a corporate system that is cheaper for people who, again, are stuck, right? They're stuck in a certain economic status that can only afford this food. How do you either lower the price of food that's healthier for you, or how do you convert to a system where it will automatically lower that price because that's all we grow?
So education, I think, is one thing. Like me coming out of college, I had a choice. Like I could go live on this land in like the north slope of the mountains in New Hampshire, and really, I really know from the beginning going into this, I'm not going to make any money. I'm going to eat better than anybody I know. I'm not going to work and make any money. There's people I know who have chosen to go into New York, the Boston market, and work in the financial sector, who commute in and out of the city, who wear suits, who eat horribly, who do not exercise, who they're facing health dilemmas like high blood pressure and stuff that, like, don't worry about that. I was educated to make that choice, and I know that I don't really have like a big chunk of cash to retire on, but I have my personal health and well-being. I have my conscience, which is something you can't buy. And so, you know, all this time that I've spent outdoors, all this time I've spent with the land, with the earth, making this connection to eating vibrant food, I'm so much more wealthy than my poor brother who got stuck, you know, going up and down an elevator. It's not the way I want to live. It's not the way I want to go out. So I received that education fairly early and was able to make those choices, those life choices. And really happy for that.
I think my question is sort of related to his, but, and it's sort of an answer in some ways, but I think that if we can change public opinion about the need to move away from industrialized agriculture, then ultimately, in some ways, hopefully, we could change the beliefs, the opinions of, you know, large organizations, institutions, policymakers, government officials, things like that. What do you think? And I'm thinking about all these like horrifying advertisements that you were showing of pesticides, which were, I guess, made to convince people of something, to convince people of safety. So what do you think the most effective way what are the most effective ways to convince the public that we need to make a change, that we need to move away from industrialized agriculture and focus more on permaculture and other similar systems.
Well, one of the things which I think is important, I showed those old ads. I still see some of those today, but they're done in more subtle ways. So our language has changed, our discourse has changed, but it still has similar messages. So I got a flyer at my house a couple of years ago, which I quoted in my book, that had something like the tagline, "Weeds are not just ugly, they're dangerous." And, you know, that was in 2014, 2013. And so it seems like, oh, people only said such silly things in the 1950s. But no, we still say these things today, and we still believe them today. And if you go to the majority of suburbs, there's incredible social pressure that your lawn needs to look a certain way. And when you go to the supermarket, that you want to have all those bins filled up. Josh was saying they're always overflowing and they look beautiful, and yeah, we expect that. And we also expect our food to be really cheap. Now, obviously there are a lot of poor people who spend a way bigger percentage of their income on food than more affluent people. But as a country, overall, in the United States, we spend an incredibly small amount of our dollar on food. Most other wealthy countries, not just poor countries, most other wealthy countries spend way more on food. They expect to have to pay more, and they're valuing it. Whereas we expect to not have to pay, and that it should be cheap. And frankly, I feel like food should not be so cheap. If it's made with fair labor, and if it's made valuing the land, and if it's made without exploiting either the earth or people, and it's healthy, it should probably be expensive. And you should be expecting to spend more on food as opposed to buying a new item of clothing that month. Or how much are we spending on your smartphone? How much are you spending on iTunes every month? I mean, there are trade-offs. Everything's a trade-off. So, you know, that does not take away the idea that there are poor people who live in places where they don't get access to food. But for middle-class and wealthier people who are not paying really what the food is worth, I think that expectation needs to be changed.
Yeah, I think this whole thing about getting your dinner for, $1.99 or, these low price, you're going to spend such a small amount on your food, but you're willing to spend such and such for your little handheld thing. It's just like, where are your values? Like, for me, one of the crucial ways that we found to be most effective to get people recognition is flavor. Like, it's one of your senses that, because of the industrial food system, we don't get good flavor. We get salt, we get sweet. So if you really have some food that's fresh, that's nutrient dense, you can taste the difference. I mean, there's something in the sabor that's just there. It's alive. And so I found the best way to get young people, get old people, stick it in their mouths. It's one of those things. It's like a touch or emotion almost. Flavor is just a powerful sense. And so I think it's a crucial part of this whole thing. It's like, it's so individual and so visceral, so real that you can taste the crunch. You know, and it makes you feel good. You go to a fast food restaurant, fill your belly, and you feel like crap. If you eat a really nutritionally dense, rich meal, then you feel great. And you don't have to do that a couple times. You go to the bathroom and see what comes out, and that's convincing enough for me. I think we are just stuck in this culture of convenience where we really value the quick and easy, and so we've got to at some point get over that a little bit and get into the real values.
I'm going to get one more question in, and then I'm sure our speakers would be happy to talk to anybody who wants to stay after a little while and talk, but maybe one more question?
I did tell him that he was next.
So I've worked on several farms as well, and you know, I know there's never enough time in the day for a farmer. It's just how it is, and so how do farmers make it economically sustainable to not use pesticides and herbicides? You know, to sustain. I mean, you know, on a huge scale, how do you do that? You know, it's you were talking about you know, apple trees and what you could do to rid them of pests, and you know that you go out and pick potatoes, and that's great on a small scale. But you know, when you're talking about feeding 7.5 billion people, you know, how do you move toward that?
Well, I wanted to ask you a question. So I'm curious, what kind of farm are you thinking of that either that you personally worked on or that you're addressing? So a grain farm, a fruit farm, mixed?
I don't know. I'm just saying in general, how do you move away from, you know, using those pesticides?
Well, so I think part of this goes back to that gentleman's question, who was there too. It's a question of the type of farm and perhaps what you're raising. If you're not using the pesticides, it is more labor intensive. Yes. And so it's looking at size of the farm, it's looking at the number of people you have working on the farm. There's this really funny documentary. Any of you who are interested in agriculture, I recommend it. It's called King Corn, and it's just this very lighthearted documentary about corn. And one of the points they make in this film is how if you are part of an industrialized corn farm in Iowa, and you follow the pattern that everyone else does, and you spray at a certain time or whatever, that became very non-labor intensive, so a lot of the people leave the farm. So you start to have a depopulating of the small towns. So the small town where they're profiling basically collapses because so many people have left because there's no work for them on the farm anymore. And there were some farmers profiled in this film in the town who they go south for certain parts of the year because there was nothing else to do because they had stopped raising animals. They didn't do any other crops. So if you have a mixed farm, it's way more labor intensive. If you're in a certain monoculture niche of only one thing, then it's not as labor intensive. The good side might be that you could do something else as well and you might have a complementary career. The downside might be that your small rural town is going to lose people. So I think part of it depends on, there are these other effects of that type of agriculture.
Yeah, commodity prices definitely need to go up. We need to value the food more. I mean, people are looking for cheap. Institutions, you know, such as the cafeteria, they have the bottom line that they're looking at. and we've just got to put more emphasis on the food element. And it's institutions all over. Everybody's got this bottom line, and food costs, labor costs. We need to pay more for our food. I think, in terms of the overall picture, say 1940, 1950, you've got a much higher percentage of people in food production. You know, around the turn of the century, up to 50% of the population is involved in food production. So within the last 100 years, now we're at 1 or 2% of the population. So 1 out of 100 people is trying to make the food for everybody. So yeah, he's going to have to rely on mechanization. He's going to have to cut every corner he can.
So on a global scale, how do we get away from the McDonald's way of the McDonald's model, with the food just there, and get, people growing their own food, it's.
I think reinvestment into what's really valuable, our health.
Sure.
Is a big part of that, and the health of the planet. So if we're willing to cut corners, no, we're not going to get there.
I completely agree.
So I think ultimately we're going to need more farmers, and we're going to have a farm system that really values the people on the land. So trying to get direct to consumer, farm to table, those kind of operations up and running. So it's just lowers the tax pressure on the farmers and raises their possibility to make a profit or make revenue.
So obviously lots more to say. I want to thank our presenters for talking to us tonight.